name is Christopher Shipley. I'm the Executive Director of Public Policy for Encompass. Thank you all for sticking around. We have two more panels to go, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next one, seeing as how for Encompass, I do all of our in-house robocall and robotexting work. But I am thrilled. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I do other things. I'll be back for pole attachments in half an hour. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Tamar Finn, who is going to be moderating our panel today. And I'd like to thank each and every one of our guests, Bill Hunt from Bandwidth, John Haraburda from TNS, and Michael Pryor, Counsel to the Cloud Communications Alliance. I'm looking forward to today's panel, and I wish you all the very best. Thanks.
And thank you, Bill, John, and Michael for joining. So everybody knows what robocalls and robotexts are. Of course, nobody wants the call from the IRS scam outside the country, right? But you do want your call from your doctor's office or from your school. It's very important that those calls get through and they don't get labeled as spam. And so the industry and the FCC have been working together, adopting rules and practices and trying to make sure that we stop the robocalls. But we also have kind of standardized, non-discriminatory rules that let the calls through that the consumers really want to receive. So we've got some great panelists here today to talk about it from different aspects of the industry. And Bill, I'd like to start with you. From Bandwidth's perspective, how have the proliferation of robocalls and robotext impacted you as a service provider? And what has Bandwidth done to address these issues?
Turn the button on. Okay. I think the audience needs to thank Tamar before we get started. It was my idea to announce the start of this with a robocall to everybody, but Tamar didn't feel it would be a very good idea. And I thought if we use Chip's really slow Mississippi drawl, it could be a really long robocall. But that didn't work either. So just a little bit about Bandwidth. Bandwidth is historically a CLEC. Started in the voice space, and we offer telephone numbers, emergency services, kind of a lot of the inputs. So as the industry has evolved, we have been in the middle of everything from intercarrier ComPerform and universal service to now robotext and robocalls. And how it's impacted the business is it leads to a lot of lost or misdirected resources. There's additional know your customer work you have to do. There's additional network work you have to do because, robocalls take up a lot of capacity on your network. They're very short calls. Their capacity that gets really wasted. They're not worth the effort and the time and the expense when they come through your network, but you have to take them and you have to terminate them along. You have to deal with law enforcement, attorney generals, the FCC. So there's a lot of lost resources that go into fighting robotexting, and we have been at the forefront. We were in the room when Chairman Wheeler created the task force, and most of you probably know Greg Rogers more than you would know me. But Greg has been like a crusader in this space. He's very passionate about it, as Mr. Shipley knows from all of the work that we do. But we really are intent, and we really want to find a way to ban these calls. We don't want to deal with them. They're not good for your reputation as a carrier. They hurt you in your relationships with other carriers. And I think the solution, Tamar, at the end of the day is we would just love to see ubiquitous IP interconnection on commercially reasonable terms, because a lot of the benefit of stir shaken is still being lost because there are TDM parts of the network that can't handle the signal. So that's our first.
Thank you, Bill. Michael, you represent the Cloud Communications Alliance. Can you talk about what the cloud service providers are doing to deal with the robocalls?
Sure. And the Cloud Communications Alliance is a sort of small trade association whose members are primarily over-the-top VoIP and UCaaS and PCaaS providers. And we actually get to work closely with Encompass, and we're pleased to do that on a lot of these robocall issues. What has kind of happened over the last few years as the Commission realized that regulations and laws like the TCPA aren't really doing a good job of curbing robocalls is looking for either technological solutions like STIR/SHAKEN, or expanding authorizations or mandatory blocking. So from the perspective of the Cloud Communications Alliance members who are trying to serve businesses who are very interested in talking to their customers, the balancing act for them on one hand is, to the extent that they're originating providers, they've implemented STIR/SHAKEN, they've committed the resources and the time and efforts to do that. And as just mentioned, there's a bit of concern about that, because while they've spent these resources to develop the means to sign calls using the STIR/SHAKEN protocols, those calls aren't getting through to the end user. But the other thing that they've done is, they've taken very seriously know your customer rules. They try to exercise due diligence in who they're serving. There are some members who just make it as a business policy. Their customer base is not going to include people who make mass calling. So that varies the risk that they're willing to take. But it really is emblematic of where we've come in the last few years, where essentially the communications community has been deputized as the robocall police. And they have really these enormous responsibilities on them now, with pretty dire consequences if they don't really do a reasonable job of trying to identify, to the extent possible, and keep off their networks illegal robocalls and texts.
So, John, can you describe the TNS solutions and how you partner with and help carriers in addressing?
Certainly, Tamar. Yeah, thanks for having me here, and thanks to the staff here at Encompass. So, TNS is a infrastructure as a service provider. We provide service holistically to several hundred service providers across the country and Canada. For the robocall mitigation solution, we provide this service for over 150 service providers in the US and Canada. We provide the full STIR/SHAKEN authentication and verification function. We run the call validation and treatment, which is the solution I'm responsible for, called Call Guardian. We also have app-based applications to allow the consumer interface to bring that presentation to the consumer on the handset to be able to help manage that experience. We then also have a service integration elevation that we're working on with some of the smaller carriers and legacy networks to really do advanced technology improvement to bring, as you mentioned, into the IP space. Because we see that same issue, and this is something I report on in the quarterly robocall report that TNS produces on every quarter. We've been seeing, since the implementation of STIR/SHAKEN, a steady improvement in gradation of sign traffic by the major service providers. They're doing a wonderful job. The problem that we're seeing now is a disparity of the non-top 7 carriers. And we're seeing a bigger divergence over time of this STIR/SHAKEN experience getting lost with these smaller providers, which I'm sure many of you are representing and supporting. So one of the things we're trying to do with this is to enable that progression into SIP, exactly as you mentioned. If we enable the SIP to SIP interconnection, if we enable the communication of what STIR/SHAKEN is doing, the translation of the know your customer from the originating side to the terminating, we can get a much better experience. So that's this quick overview of the solution sets.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So the FCC has many rules in this area, right? We've got the call blocking with reasonable analytics, the authentication, the traceback. So, John, you said you've seen improvement with the top 7, but are these rules working, and are they working as intended? So, John, you want to start?
Well, that's an interesting question. So we've been filing some comments through FCC, right, with the 8th order and the new one discussing AI NOI that came out. And we've been pitching and describing the solutions that we have, right? We provide the service for the terminating service provider. So the terminating service provider has the determination of what the treatment should be of these calls and the identification of the service that they want to offer their subscribers. We then offer, in some circumstances, subscriber-based preferences where the individual subscriber can define how they want to manage that experience of traffic being marked, et cetera, coming to them. One thing to note is that with all of this traffic, almost, over 95% of the traffic still gets to the handset. So the blocking is not really the issue, it's the labeling and identification. And again, this comes back to the ability of translating the knowledge from a stir-shaken authentication service to be able to go to the terminating side with pure SIP interconnectivity. So I think there's some opportunities to keep working. We've seen some progress, but we want to keep making the industry go forward and build this up.
Michael?
Yeah, I think, I don't remember a time, and I've been at this for a while, so many orders coming so quickly on a topic. You barely have time to understand what the last rule was before another set of rules comes out. And it's really hard to stay on top of this. And frankly, I don't know. I haven't really seen any hard data that suggests that robocalling has materially decreased as a result of this. Maybe that's not the right test. But I think sort of the jury's out whether all of this is going to work. I think it's interesting with respect to stir shaken, and we've talked about the problem with TDM and the need for IP interconnection is maybe a way to solve that problem. But many of these robocalls come in from foreign countries, and the FCC has placed very specific obligations on gateway providers that may reduce this somewhat. But it's an international problem, and countries are going different directions. England has said we're not going to do stir shaken. I think France says, yeah, we are going to do stir shaken. Spain is trying to make up its mind. So it's an interesting international problem as well as a problem domestically.
Yeah.
Bill, did you want to add anything?
Sure. You said earlier that given all the rules and it would really become deputized. Did you get a badge? And where do I get one? Yeah.
We don't even know.
I feel like I should have.
No, that all of the work that's been coming out of the FCC and the rules just reflects how annoying these calls are and how there's just universal acceptance. So we have to find a way to stop these. So that's why I think we're seeing a lot of that. But what you've kind of touched on a little bit, John, is this concept of analytic providers or entities who are in the call flow, who are providing a service maybe to one carrier, that you then become the gateway to get to that carrier. And whether the calls get through are, pretty much premised on the quality of your data and, the source of it, and whether it's almost a pay to play, kind of like, give us your information, we'll put your numbers in our database. A carrier that maybe says, no, I don't want to sell you my numbers or give you my numbers,
Right.
doesn't, then has to deal with that. So how do you work through that process? Because, unlike Michael, I think we would agree with you, IP is the way. We've seen a reduction in robocalls, especially as you get, like, one of the things that's come out of this is the transparency is like when the FCC lists 14 people that they kick out of the RMD, you make sure they're not on your network, and then you go to the Salesforce and say, don't touch these guys, right? So the more transparency, the more information is good, but it's still whack-a-mole because there's always going to be somebody popping up somewhere. But we always struggle with the pay-to-play and the fact that something can be mislabeled and then the recourse. So how's that work in your
that's not an uncommon comment that I've heard, right? So part of the issue, right, is understanding what we do. And again, this is part of our NOI commentary that we did on AI. So the way that the analytics engines work, it's actually machine learning artificial intelligence that's using several dozen features to actually process each and every call independently and scoring it. So one of the issues that we do see is when we do get a call in for a redress process, right? A redress was when you get a call that has been identified, had been marked as spam, you don't think it should have been. You contact the service provider and process that. Over 80% of the time, we're seeing that number had already been naturalized to a normal score by the time the record came in. Because the key is this algorithm that's running is not a static database, right? It's no longer a whitelist, blacklist, or a dump file of dial code plans that you use for a country. It's an integrate combination that includes all the activity that we see, not only for customer A, but for the other 149 that we support. And additionally, and I'd say more importantly, we ingest and process and integrate commentary from the consumer to play a role with how those traffic is being identified. So we're getting the consumer coming back to us in real time, telling us that this number is making dodgy traffic. And often what we see is we'll see legitimate traffic coming through with one set of information and illegitimate traffic with another, where that number is being spoofed by an illicit source. And this is one of the problems that we have, right, with ubiquitous stir shaking capabilities, enabling SIP interconnectivity. So that's one part, right? Understanding the AI component and the multi-factor function and the natural learning and real-time rescoring that naturally happens. The other piece of the puzzle is that when I give a subscriber the ability to define how they want to manage the experience on their device to receive calls, that's their decision, right? I'm only doing what the service provider who has contracted us to provide and give them the service. They've given me a box in which to work in as far as how they want to control traffic on their network. And then within the subscriber, they have their own preferences. So I think as we get to the point of making more ubiquitous coverage, enabling better identification of traffic, differentiating the spoof traffic versus legitimate, right, in real time, this is where we can get to a better delivery system. Because I've heard the commentary from, especially providers like you, right, or the people you represent, is I've gone through the KYC process, right? I know this customer. I know the 3 questions that I need to answer for the attestation value in stir shaken. I can answer that legitimacy. Well, that may be at your spot, but by the time it goes through your network, you'd say, well, I know who the carrier is. I know the connectivity, but I don't know the telephone number because I didn't sell it to you. So I have to give it a B attestation or C, right? And this is where we get into some issues where the pieces of the puzzle are there within the stir shaken framework that the IPNNI has defined. We just need to keep moving forward. And I mean, honestly, we just hit last June with the last tier of the mandate from the FCC to participate and use, right? So we're basically still in this learning phase, right? The big carriers have had 3 years to work with this. We're moving forward, and we need to keep progressing with the smaller carriers, right? And a lot of the customers of Encompass to help support and bring that, because what do we want, right? You want, from the enterprise side, to have your customers be able to connect with their consumers. You, from an aggregator side, want to say, I want to bring traffic and I want to have billable conversation time. From the service providers I support on the terminating side, they want to bring that to the consumer because they get value as a terminating provider, bringing that traffic and being that conduit to that consumer. So everyone wants this to happen, right? We just now have to continue the progress to keep learning and refining and define how we do this better and make the standards work and apply across the board.
So, Bill, you mentioned inter-carrier compensation. A long time ago, the FCC said there's a terminating access monopoly, right? Mm-hmm. So the service provider who's providing the service to the customer that is terminating that call, they have a monopoly on getting calls to that particular customer via that means. So I think one of the things we're struggling with, and I'm hearing, right, are those, the call analytics and the labeling and everything, how do we make sure that that is non-discriminatory, right? I think it's not just, the AI learning, but it's making sure, like you said, there's no pay to play and that everybody kind of is treated fairly. There's a redress method. Mm-hmm. And so, Bill, do you have recommendations or thoughts there?
Well, great summary of the problem. Thank you very much. No, because we're just really worried about you move one terminating or one monopoly or one bottleneck to another, and you just kind of move it down the road, right? And that's so. Again, we would love to see IP interconnection. We think that's got a lot to do with it too. The ability to handle everything and through this and have headers pass through completely. Some transparency, and actually, I'd be curious because I'm going to ask quite nothing about this that I'm about to ask you. Do you guys have transparency in what your standards are of what goes into the black box that TNS does? If you're an aggregator or another carrier and you're not one of your subscribers and you want to send traffic, is there a cheat sheet checklist, something that tells you how it's going to get through?
And calling practices, best practice that we distribute with redress requests And in the case where we do not adjust the score and identify that this is legitimate traffic, we'll send that back to do things such as ramp up traffic, stop cycling through numbers, actually leave voicemail and connect to the customers, because we collect information such as conversation duration, whether calls are answered. All these are part of the algorithms that we're processing to help determine what's valid or not, right? And this gets into that intent of the language. And additionally, we're adding in tools, and we've been building things looking at natural language processing, actually looking at honeypotting to collect transcripts to understand what's being said on the call, right? So there's a difference between a number making a phone call versus a party making a call claiming something using a number, right? And differentiating that is our responsibility as the call validation and treatment engine, right? You as a provider validate the party to whom you've done your KYC, but it's some other person who is generating this malicious traffic that gets identified that messes up the party for everybody. So we got to find ways to address these and find those and identify it. So yeah, I can share that with the team here, and even through Chris, we can share that and distribute it of the TNS best practices that we have. Yeah.
Michael, do you want to talk about redress and the importance of that process?
Yeah, we've heard that term a couple of times, and maybe I'll just back up and maybe explain what that is. As the FCC continued to ratchet up the amount of blocking it was either authorizing or mandating, including blocking in the network based on reasonable analytics, the kind of algorithms that we've been discussing, there is a concern that legitimate traffic is getting blocked. And none of these systems are infallible. So we were, a group of us, including the Cloud Communications Group and others, were intent when the Trace Act was passed to get in some language that talked about the need for effective and transparent redress. So if your legitimate calls are getting blocked, you have a mechanism to get those calls unblocked. It took a while with working at the FCC, but there's a redress rule codified for analytics-based blocking, where the terminating provider has to do two things. One is, importantly, it has to send a real-time notification to the originator that the call is being blocked. And the second thing is it has to have a process once a claim has been made that there's been an erroneous block. How are you going to process that? The rules require that that be done within a reasonable period of time, status update within 24 hours. There's a credible claim, it has to happen faster. So all those rules are in the books, but they only apply to calling, and there's still some work to be done on the notification issue. But those rules don't apply, they don't apply to labeling, which has become, I think, maybe even a bigger issue than blocking. When you pick up your phone and you see spam, is that really spam, or is it a legitimate call that's been been mislabeled? Our law firm in Denver, for example, for a while, its outgoing calls were labeled as spam. It was really taking us off. So we had to work through that. So we've been trying to get the FCC to take those codified rules about redress and notification and have them apply to texting. And while companies will respond, there's not a codified rule in place. There's not a standardized process. The FCC is moving now into the texting world and trying to more or less translate all of its voice blocking into the texting world. But we'd also like to see some kind of notification or redress, if possible, transferred into the texting world as the FCC starts to mandate blocking of texts. So that has been a huge issue. We think it's one way to kind of balance this, trying to get the really bad traffic off while also trying not to get good calls blocked, or at least for too long.
Go ahead.
Michael, is it on the labeling? We do agree. I mean, labeling is a problem, especially as it becomes more and more another service that you pay for, and there's yet another bottleneck to go through. But it also seems to reflect moving away from CNAM, the database, and that's just kind of out there and nobody ever uses it anymore, and we're heading toward labeling. Is that?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to think about labeling. One is, I was kind of talking about when the analytics engine makes a decision about whether traffic is suspicious or not, it makes the recommendation. You could put a spam label on that. That's one kind of labeling. The other kind of labeling is, let's say you've got, an A attestation that gets through. Should you see a label on your phone that says check mark, at least number not spoofed, explained in some way.
Verified identifier.
Verified
identifier.
identifier. Right.
Yeah.
I think where the FCC needs to go here is not simply to authenticate a number, but to authenticate the identity of the person calling or sending the text. There's rich call data is one protocol that's being reviewed. But yeah, CNAM, that people have concerns about CNAM being up to date. And there's questions about, who should be in control of the information that gets sent through the network. CNAM, I think, right, the terminating provider does the CNAM dip. But maybe it ought to be rich call data thinks the originating provider ought to put the label on that says, this is, here's who's calling you. Maybe even here's why they're calling you. We know the number's not spoofed. You can trust this, right? Because it's funny, we've been hearing all day about connectivity, but on the other side, we're losing trust in these networks because people don't want to answer the phone. So we really need to have, systems in place that can verify the identity so that when somebody sees, this is, my dentist office calling me, I can be reasonably sure, yes, that's my dentist calling, I'll pick it up.
The only problem is that rich call display works as good as stir shaking does when you go to TDM.
Right.
Well,
Right.
that's another reason.
And that's the glitch, right? So you lose, this is the frustrating part, right? Because, we do services for originating carriers doing the AS service within stir shaking. So we're signing traffic on that service provider's behalf, sending it out. And when I see that coming back to me via another carrier as a terminating, I'm seeing no stir shaken, right? Because it went through a tandem or some other provider where that missed, right? So all the work that was done in the front, all the KYC work that was done and leveraged, right, is disappeared in the network and lost and not available to the terminating side. And that's ubiquitous across all the providers, not unlike myself, but the other ones that run the other big two mobile carriers, right?
So you can have the panel back.
So yeah, no, it's been a great discussion, and I'm sure we could go on for a while. Unfortunately, we need to move to pole attachments. So I think the answer is IP interconnection, right? Everyone,
We
who's
agree.
IP interconnection. And
Bipartisan approval.
thank you so much.